Welcome to our deep dive, everyone, where we'll be tackling how life arose from non-living matter.
It's a question that has puzzled people for, well, centuries.
Yeah, and the source material we'll be looking at today is fascinating. It's a detailed explanation originally in Hindi.
It's a story filled with interesting characters, unexpected discoveries, and even a little bit of, well, what some might consider space vodka.
Space vodka, that's a new one.
Oh, you'll see.
All right, well, I'm ready to dive in. Where should we even begin with a topic as big as the origin of life?
Well, a good starting point, I think, is to look at how early scientists thought about it. Way back when.
Okay, so before Darwin and all that.
Exactly.
Uh,
Back then, a lot of scientists believed in this idea of a life force.
Right, so living things had some kind of special energy or spark that set them apart from rocks and water and stuff.
Exactly, like some kind of mystical force that animated living things.
Okay, but I'm guessing that idea didn't last too long?
Well, you're right about that. A number of experiments started to chip away at the life force concept.
Was that with Lavoisier and his experiments with guinea pigs?
You got Antoine Lavoisier in the 18th century. He was a meticulous scientist, and what he did was he measured the heat given off by a guinea pig,
Interesting.
and he compared it to the heat generated by burning a piece of coal. What he found was that the amount of coal needed to melt a certain amount of ice was the same as the amount of heat generated by the guinea pig to melt that same amount of ice.
So he was basically showing that living things follow the same physical laws as non-living things?
That's one way to put it. It was a big step towards a more scientific, less mystical understanding of life.
Okay, so Lavoisier kind of rained on the life force parade a little bit.
He did. And then along came Luigi Galvani and his experiments with frog legs.
Oh yeah, I've heard about this. Didn't he think he discovered animal electricity?
That's the one. He observed that a frog's leg would twitch when it came into contact with metal.
I can see how he might jump to that conclusion.
Well, at the time, it seemed like he had found the elusive life force, but it was actually Alessandro Volta.
The battery guy.
Yes, Volta, who pointed out that the twitching was really a reaction between two different metals that Galvani was using.
So another blow to the life force idea.
Right. But even though these early experiments weren't perfect, they were really important because they shifted scientific thinking away from mystical explanations.
Okay, so we're moving away from life force and towards a more scientific approach.
Exactly. And the next big breakthrough came with Friedrich Wöhler and his accidental discovery of how to make urea in the lab.
Okay, back up a second. What's urea?
It's one of the main components of pee.
So he accidentally made pee in the lab.
In a way, yes. More importantly, what he did was synthesize an organic compound, the kind found in living things, from inorganic materials.
Oh, I see. So before this, scientists thought that organic compounds could only be produced by, well, living organisms.
Right. It was a pretty big deal because it showed that you didn't need some kind of special life force to create these compounds.
Okay, so another nail in the life force coffin.
Exactly.
Huh.
And then Marshall and Berthelot took this idea even further with his total synthesis program.
What was that? He basically wanted to create all the known organic compounds from scratch to prove that they weren't anything special.
Like a mad scientist in his lab mixing and matching elements.
Something like that, but with a lot more precision and planning.
So we've gone from mystical life force to realizing that the building blocks of life can actually be created from non-living matter.
That's the gist of it. But it still doesn't quite answer the question of what makes something alive.
Right. It's one thing to say that organic compounds can come from non-living matter, but it's another to define what life actually is.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that your source material does really well. It delves into all the complexities and challenges of defining life.
Okay, I am all ears.
Well, we often think of things like movement, growth, reproduction, and responding to the environment as characteristics of living things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But there are always exceptions. What about plants? They don't move around like animals do.
Good point.
Or what about mules? They can't reproduce, but they're obviously alive. Okay, so those typical characteristics aren't foolproof.
You got it. So the source material suggests this idea of self-reproduction with variation as a key feature of life.
So something is alive if it can make copies of itself, but with little changes that allow for adaptation and evolution.
Right. It's a subtle but important distinction.
Okay, I'm starting to see how complex this question of defining life really is.
It is. And it's essential to understanding how life might have started.
So to figure out the origin of life, we need to figure out Not just how those building blocks came together, but also how they gained the ability to copy themselves and change over time.
Exactly. It's like solving a giant puzzle with multiple layers.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
Well, now that we've established that life likely arose from non-living matter, the next question is, where did those building blocks come from in the first place?
Good question. Where did they come from?
Well, one theory suggests that they came from space.
Hold on, are we talking about aliens here?
Not exactly, but the idea is pretty out there. The panspermia theory proposes that the seeds of life might have originated somewhere else in the universe and were delivered to Earth.
Okay, that does sound like something out of a science fiction movie, but is there any actual evidence to back that up?
There is. And this is where the source material really shines. It talks about how scientists have found organic molecules like formaldehyde and cyanide.
Those don't sound very life-giving.
Well, they're actually key ingredients in the building blocks of life. And they've been found in interstellar clouds, on comets, and even in meteorites.
Wow, so it's not just empty space out there. It's like a giant cosmic pantry stocked with the ingredients for life.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And think about it. During Earth's early history, there was a period of intense bombardment by comets and meteorites.
Oh, yeah, I remember learning about that. So those impacts could have brought those organic molecules to Earth.
Exactly, like a delivery service from space.
Okay, so we've got the potential building blocks of life raining down from space. That's pretty cool. But how did those simple molecules transform into the more complex structures we see in living things?
Well, that's where the famous primordial soup comes in.
Ah, yes, I've heard of this. It's like the classic origin of life scenario.
Right. The idea is that early Earth was like a giant simmering cauldron of organic molecules.
So we're talking warm ponds or shallow seas filled with all those molecules that came from space?
Exactly. And then you add energy from the sun and maybe lightning strikes, and those molecules start bumping into each other and reacting.
And this is where the Miller-Urey experiment comes in, right? They recreated those conditions in the lab.
You got a Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. They took a bunch of simple molecules like water vapor, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen gas, put in a closed system, and zapped them with Starks to simulate light.
To recreate those early Earth conditions.
And guess what? After just a week, they found amino acids in their experiment.
Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins? That's amazing.
Right. And it was a big deal because it showed that under the right conditions, those simple molecules could spontaneously form more complex structures.
Okay, so we've got the building blocks, we've got the primordial soup. What else do we need?
Well, there's another fascinating hypothesis that involves clay.
Clay, like the stuff kids play with?
The very same.
Uh,
It turns out clay might have played a pretty important role in the origin of life.
okay, how so?
Well, clay has a really interesting structure. It's got these charged surfaces that can attract and concentrate organic molecules.
So like a magnet for the building blocks of life.
Exactly. And by bringing those molecules close together, clay could have helped them react and form even larger, more complex structures.
Okay, so we've got the building blocks, the primordial soup clay, acting as a matchmaker. What's next?
Well, now we enter the RNA world.
The RNA world. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
So before there was DNA, the molecule that carries our genetic information, there was RNA.
I thought RNA was just a helper molecule for DNA.
It does a lot of that in modern cells.
Yeah.
But RNA can actually do some pretty amazing things. It can store genetic information like DNA.
Really?
Yeah. And it can also act as a catalyst for chemical reactions, which is something that proteins usually do.
So RNA is like a multi-talented molecule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why some scientists think that RNA might have been the first self-replicating molecule, the molecule that kick-started life.
So it's like a world where RNA was doing it all, replicating itself, driving chemical reactions, and setting the stage for the evolution of more complex systems.
Exactly.
It's a pretty cool idea.
It is. So how did we go from an RNA world to the DNA and protein-based world we see today?
Well, one theory is that RNA, through its self-replication and evolution, eventually gave rise to proteins. Proteins are more stable and versatile catalysts than RNA, so they gradually took over a lot of RNA's functions.
So in a way, RNA created its own successors. That's fascinating. And what about DNA? Where does it fit into this?
Well, DNA is much more stable than RNA. It's less likely to make mistakes when it copies itself, so it's a better molecule for storing genetic information long term. Okay, that makes sense. So DNA evolved later, probably from RNA, as a more reliable way to store the genetic blueprint of life.
That's the current thinking.
Yeah.
It's like an upgrade from RNA to DNA.
Okay, so we've got the building blocks, we've got self-replication, but we're still missing one crucial piece of the puzzle. How did all these molecules get organized into something resembling a cell?
Ah, yes. That's a key question. How did those first cells, or at least something like cells, come to be? So we lift off with the idea of protocells, those tiny membrane-bound compartments that might have been the precursors to true cells.
Right, but how do we go from those simple structures to the complex life we see today?
Mm.
Plants, animals, fungi, everything.
Well, it's a long and fascinating journey, and it involves a merger of epic proportions.
A merger. Okay, now I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Picture this, the ancient ocean teeming with single-celled organisms, all vying for resources and survival. Among them were two main groups, the archaea and the bacteria.
Archaea and bacteria. Those are two very different types of cells, right?
They are. But their paths were about to cross in a way that would forever change the course of life on Earth.
Okay, so what happened? Did they clash? Did they fight for dominance?
Not exactly. It's thought that these archaea and bacteria started living in close proximity, maybe in an environment like those hydrothermal vents we talked about,
Okay, so they were neighbors. Maybe they were even helping each other out.
possibly sharing resources or providing some kind of protection. And the closer they lived, the more intertwined their fates became.
Okay, I can see where this is going.
And then, in a remarkable twist of fate one day, a bacterium got a little too close to an archaeon and was engulfed by it.
Engulfed, like eaten.
Exactly. But instead of being digested, the bacterium somehow managed to survive inside the archaeon.
Wow, so you have one cell living inside another cell. That's mind-boggling.
It is. And what's even more amazing is that the bacterium didn't just survive, it continued to thrive and reproduce within its new host.
Okay, but why didn't the archaeon destroy the bacterium? And wouldn't that be the normal response?
Well, it turns out this arrangement was mutually beneficial. The bacterium, safe and sound inside the archaeon, continued to provide whatever benefit it had been offering before. And now it was even more efficient because it was sharing resources and enjoying the protection of its host.
So it was a win-win for both of them.
Exactly, a classic example of symbiosis. And over millions of years, this partnership became increasingly intimate.
Intimate. How so?
Well, the bacterium gradually lost its independence and became an integral part of the archaeon cell.
So they became one.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
And that, my friend, is how we believe mitochondria came to be.
Wait, mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. You're telling me they were once free-living bacteria?
The very same.
Inc-
Incredible, isn't it? Those tiny energy factories that power our bodies, that allow plants to grow and animals to move, were once swimming around in the ancient ocean as independent organisms.
This is blowing my mind. So how did scientists figure this out?
Well, a lot of the credit goes to Lynn Margulis. She was a visionary scientist who championed this theory back in the 1960s.
I've heard of her. She faced a lot of skepticism at first, right?
She did. But her research, especially her studies of mitochondrial DNA, provided strong evidence to support her ideas. And now it's widely accepted in the scientific community.
So what's so special about mitochondrial DNA?
Well, for one thing, it's separate from the DNA in the cell's nucleus. It's like mitochondria have their own little genetic blueprint.
Okay, that's interesting. So they carry a piece of their bacterial past with them.
Exactly. And if you compare the DNA sequence of mitochondria to various bacteria, you find a close match with a type of bacteria that causes typhus.
Typhus. That's serious disease. So there's a little piece of a disease-causing bacterium living inside every cell of our body. That's kind of creepy.
Yeah, it is a bit strange when you think about it that way. But remember, this merger happened billions of years ago. And over time, that bacterium has evolved and adapted to become an essential beneficial part of our cells.
So it's a reminder that evolution can take something potentially harmful and turn it into something vital for life.
Precisely. And it makes you wonder how many other symbiotic mergers have happened throughout evolutionary history.
That's a good question. But getting back to mitochondria, why was this merger such a big deal? What advantage did it give those early cells?
Well, the incorporation of mitochondria was a game changer. It dramatically increased the energy capacity of cells, allowing them to grow larger, become more complex, and eventually evolve into multicellular organisms.
So mitochondria were like tiny power boosts, giving those cells the energy they needed to take things to the next level.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about energy. The merger also introduced new genes into the archaeon cell. Remember, mitochondria have their own DNA, and that DNA carries genes that are essential for mitochondrial function.
So the archaeon got a genetic upgrade.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And some of those mitochondrial genes even migrated to the cell's nucleus, further integrating the two genomes and increasing the genetic complexity of eukaryotic cells.
So the two cells really became one, not just physically, but also genetically. And this merger paved the way for the evolution of all the amazing diversity of life we see today.
Exactly. But we still haven't fully answered the question of how those single-celled eukaryotes made the leap to multicellularity.
Right. What happened next? How did they go from individual cells to complex organisms with tissues and organs?
Well, imagine a population of single-celled eukaryotes living together, maybe in a colony or a biofilm. It's like a microbial community.
So they're hanging out together, but they're still individual cells.
Right. But over time, some of these cells might have started to specialize, taking on different roles within the colony for the benefit of the group.
Like a division of labor, different cells contributing their unique skills to the success of the community.
Precisely. Some might have become better at acquiring nutrients, while others focused on reproduction or defense.
Okay, so we're starting to see the very beginnings of specialization.
Exactly. And as these specializations became more pronounced, the cells became increasingly interdependent. They couldn't survive on their own anymore. They needed each other.
So it's like a group project where everyone has to pull their weight.
And this interdependence led to a tighter integration of the cells, eventually forming truly multicellular organisms, where the cells were no longer independent units but parts of a larger whole.
So it's a gradual shift from a loose collection of individuals to a more tightly knit community.
Exactly. And this transition to multicellularity opened up a whole new world of possibilities. It allowed organisms to grow larger, explore new environments, and develop more complex structures and functions.
It's like going from a one-person show to a full-blown orchestra.
I like that analogy. Each cell is like a musician playing its part in a grand symphony of life.
But to take the analogy a bit further, you need a conductor to coordinate the orchestra, right? So how did these multicellular organisms develop systems of coordination and control?
That's a great question. And that takes us to another incredible milestone in the evolution of life, the development of specialized cells for communication and control, the precursors to what we now call the nervous system.
Whoa, the nervous system. So we're talking about the very beginnings of brains and senses.
Exactly. But we'll have to save that part of the story for next time. We're running out of time for this segment.
I can't wait. We've explored how a chance encounter between an archaeon and a bacterium led to the evolution of complex cells, and we've seen how those cells learned to cooperate and specialize, paving the way for the rise of multicellular life.
It's a truly amazing story, and there's so much more to come.
I'm ready for the next chapter. Welcome back to our deep dive exploring how life began. We've journeyed from non-living matter to the first multicellular organisms, and now we're ready for the final chapter.
We'll be looking at the rise of those complex life forms you mentioned, including us.
It's incredible how those early eukaryotic cells, with their newfound energy from mitochondria, started working together and specializing.
Yeah, it was a turning point.
Yeah.
Multicellularity opened up so many possibilities for life to become bigger, more intricate, and better at adapting to different environments.
Last time we were talking about those early multicellular organisms and how some cells started taking on specific roles, almost like a division of labor.
Right. And as those specializations became more pronounced, those cells began grouping together, forming layers and tissues.
Ah, so instead of just a random jumble of cells, you start to see a more organized structure.
Exactly. And each of those tissues became good at a specific task. Like a layer of cells specialized for protection, forming a simple kind of skin.
And maybe another layer specializing in absorbing nutrients, a primitive digestive system.
That's the idea. We're starting to see the very first glimpses of organs and organ systems.
That's amazing. But how did those early organisms manage all these different tissues and make sure they all work together?
That's where things get even more mind-blowing. As those multicellular organisms became more complex, they needed ways to communicate and coordinate everything.
So like a control center.
Exactly. And that's where the nervous system enters the picture.
The nervous system, the foundation for brains and senses. That's a huge leap.
It is. It likely started with simple cells that could detect changes in their surroundings, like light temperature or chemicals.
So like sensory cells.
Yes, and they would then send signals to other cells, causing a response.
Ah, so they were developing a way to communicate internally, allowing different parts of their bodies to talk to each other.
Right. And as those signaling pathways became more complex, they formed networks of interconnected cells, the early versions of nerves and brains.
So those early organisms were getting smarter.
In a way, yes. Those evolving nervous systems allowed them to react to their surroundings better, to move with more precision, and to develop more advanced behaviors.
It's remarkable. We've come such a long way from those simple molecules, self-replicating RNA protocells, to multicellular organisms with tissues and nervous systems. It's like witnessing a grand symphony of evolution.
And the story continues. Multicellularity paved the way for another game-changing innovation, sexual reproduction.
Ah, yes. The mixing of genes from two parents to create unique offspring. It's like nature shuffling the deck of cards with each generation.
Exactly. Sexual reproduction brought a whole new level of genetic diversity into play.
It's like evolution got a turbo boost. Instead of relying solely on random mutations, organisms could now combine genes in new ways through sexual reproduction.
leading to a faster pace of adaptation and diversification.
It makes sense why life exploded into so many different forms once sexual reproduction took hold.
It was a defining moment. It set the stage for the evolution of all the plants and animals we see today, including us.
Speaking of us, where do humans fit into this incredible evolutionary tale?
Well, humans are relatively new to the scene. We share a common ancestor with all other primates, and our lineage branched off just a few million years ago.
A blink of an eye compared to the vast timescale of Earth's history.
Exactly. We're just a small part of this grand saga of life, a chapter that's still being written.
This deep dive has given us a new appreciation for how interconnected we are with all life on Earth. It's amazing to think about all the events, the chance encounters, and adaptations that were needed to lead to us.
It truly is awe-inspiring. And if life could arise from non-living matter here, it makes you wonder, could it have happened elsewhere in the universe?
The age-old question, are we alone? It's incredible to think about.
The possibilities are endless. And as we continue to explore our own origins and the origins of life itself, we deepen our understanding of our place in the cosmos and the importance of protecting the precious gift of life.
What an incredible journey. We've traveled billions of years from the first molecules to complex life forms like ourselves.
I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to continue exploring the wonders of the natural world.
Thank you for joining us on this adventure. Until next time, keep diving deep, questioning, and exploring.